Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started since it's noon. So our lunch and learn today is about communicating across cultures. And about me, I work in international student and scholar services. So I deal with all the immigration for our international students. So I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of a background about myself as we get started, because my culture is not the same as regular mainstream American culture, which sometimes causes, misunderstandings and some conflict for me. So one of the cultural differences is really like community versus, the individualism. My culture is more community based, whereas American culture is more about the individual. We communicate a lot with through nonverbal gestures. I also talk with my hands quite a bit. I use a lot of humor. And this is, I would also like to just put out there as a caveat that Native American culture is not all encompassing, where we have very many different tribes and how we handle things and do things are not always the same. So this is just the way my people do things. That may not be the way, another tribe would handle things. It's also, we find it unacceptable to criticize another directly. And we use a lot of storytelling in the way that we approach things. My husband typically says I give away too much information, like minimize that, but that's really hard for me considering, we're storytellers at heart. So my family background is I belong to 3 tribes. I'm Cherokee, Choctaw, and Shoshone, and Irish. So first, I want to talk about some fundamentals of communicating across cultures. A lot of this is stuff that I find important. Somebody else may find, importance in other avenues of communicating across cultures. These are things that I found helpful when I was first learning. How to navigate mainstream American culture, and then, of course, interacting with individuals from overseas. So awareness is most important. Know your audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about linear active cultures, multi-active cultures, and reactive cultures. And I gave you some examples of countries, in each group. And then I'm going to show you the Lewis model for these cultural types. So linear active cultures tend to be task-oriented, highly organized planners. They prefer direct and straightforward discussions. When we look at the multi-active cultures, they're more emotional, loquacious, and impulsive. They do attach great importance to their families, their people's feelings and relationships. Typically, they're really good multitaskers. Reactive cultures are good listeners. They rarely initiate action or discussion. They prefer first to listen and then to establish the other person's position before they react to it. When we're looking at this, the linear, we have, for example, the US, Norway, Austria, and Germany. Multi-active, Hispanic America, Saudi Arabia, and Greece. Reactive, Vietnam, Japan, China, and Canada. And again, when we go back, talking about individualistic and collective cultures, for an individualistic culture, everyone is their own person, right? They're not a representative of their family or community or any other group. They just are. Like in America, we would say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We're trying to get our individual self ahead. Examples of those, of course, would be the US, like Australia, and most other Western cultures. And when we look at collective cultures, having a strong family and friendship group is important to these societies. And people may sacrifice their happiness or time for the benefit of someone else for the greater good of the group. Examples of this would be most Native American cultures or indigenous cultures, Mexico, Portugal, Turkey, and most of our Asian countries. So when we're thinking about the interactions with these groups, especially when we're really looking at the individualistic and collective cultures, when we see these folks in the classroom or when we're interacting with them in our offices, that's when a lot of the miscommunication happens, or we have these sweeping generalizations of how these individuals are without really knowing about the culture, about, what makes that person who they are, how their society impacts their decision making and their reactions and how they socialize. So my biggest thing is to prepare for your interactions. When you're communicating with individuals from other cultures, don't think that they're just like, us here in the US. Language and how you use that language with certain groups would means causing offense to somebody or them not taking you seriously. So language is also key. Transparency. I cannot stress enough how important it is to let them know if you're struggling to understand them. It's okay to say that you're having issues understanding. I've had to do that. I've asked individuals to repeat themselves when that didn't work. I've asked them to write it down and just say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I don't say it's because of your accent or anything like that. I just say I'm just having trouble understanding. If you could write it down, that would really help me. So I can move the conversation forward, and then, I'm avoiding any type of miscommunications, misunderstandings, and I'm not, being offensive in any way. And, there is a difference when we are communicating, and especially in our communication styles, about humor versus seriousness. Know the culture. I cannot stress that enough. I know that I'm in meetings sometimes and folks are laughing and, cutting up or joking. Even when we're in some serious meetings, for some cultures, that's a big no-no and they would find that disrespectful. So just keep those things at the front of your mind. But like the number one says, be aware. And I can tell you, being on campus here, how many times, even when I say, indigenous, that I hear people use like not enough chiefs or too many chiefs, not enough Indians, or the lowest man on the totem pole, let's have a powwow, things like that, that I find super offensive, and they don't understand, or it's not really registering in their mind how important the language is that we use. Or, that's my spirit animal. That's not okay. That's the equivalent of me bringing in somebody else's religion and then using that as, for me, it would be like a joke, or so just being aware of the culture, know your audience, and make sure we're using, good language when we're communicating. This is the bicultural types. This is the Lewis model. I really like this. And you can just Google this and, you'd be able to find it. But we can see, that some of these, it's multidimensional. So while Japan is on this side of reactive, China's on this side, we're all part of this big group, but you can see where the US lies, where Germany is on this. Russia, although it's on this linear, is really closer to the multi-active. So they kind of encompass both areas. But feel free to look this up. I find it really good, and there's several scholarly articles that utilize this model. So some of the challenges, of course, the biggest one being cultural differences. If my thing is stop, breathe, notice, reflect, and respond when we're dealing with different cultures. There is no right or wrong way when we're doing things. We're just different, right? The way I do something is different than my colleagues. And I just respect them, for our differences. I try to understand. I may not always agree, but I try to understand that culture plays a huge part in our social interactions. Um, Most Americans get told, treat others the way you want to be treated. Don't do that. Because the way an American treats another American is not the way you would treat somebody else from another culture. And that's vitally important. So do not treat others the way you want to be treated. Learn that culture before interacting with that culture. So that way, when you go into those meetings or conversations, there is none of this cultural missteps happening. And it's okay when you're having these interactions to say, I just need to stop a minute. Let me think about what I say before I say it. That way you're really reflecting on that conversation, what you want to say, and choosing your words wisely. The other part is, language barrier. Do not overestimate, your counterpart's linguistic ability. We have even students on this campus that although they've met the English proficiency, test to be here, we do know linguistic ability is a challenge for some students. Some students have great verbal communication, but their written or comprehension is challenging. And then we have other students who are really good at written and comprehension, but verbal communication is very difficult for them. And it causes a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings. So just understanding and making them feel comfortable in your presence is, I find, is the biggest way to overcome a lot of the obstacles that, we face. The other part is judgment. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Have compassion for yourself and for the person that you're communicating with. I also like to say, show yourself some grace. We're going to make missteps. It happens all the time. And all you can do is, try to reorganize and get back on the right step to do these, when you're communicating. So don't judge yourself too harshly. You can always come back from anything. And then I provided this link here. So, it talks a lot about some of these items up here. I just found it really useful. And I'll be happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them. So I cannot stress enough about strategies is to learn about the culture and values of your audience. And that's both inside and outside of the US. Like I said, I've had a lot of cultural misunderstandings with Americans about my own culture. It is a little disappointing considering we're only a couple hours away from the Cherokee Nation, the Eastern Band. We should be doing a better job on this campus about that. So know your audience, know the culture. It's going to make things easier for your students, for yourself, when you're doing these interactions. The other thing is use like direct speech, common language, avoid using slang or jargon, because what I know, they may not know, or American idioms are very difficult for a lot of our international students to comprehend. They're struggling just to learn regular English. So trying to use slang or jargon with them, they're not gonna understand. So just be careful with that. And be patient. you know, again, be patient with yourself, be patient with the student or the scholar, you know, faculty member that you're working with. We're communicating in our mind and everything in English. So we don't have to think about doing a translation from English to our first language, you know, comprehending what we're saying and then trying to translate that back from our first language into our second language. So give those folks some grace also that, you know, so for some of our students and faculty, English is not their first language. So understanding how their first language, whatever it is. So if let's say if we're talking about our Chinese students, most common would be Mandarin. Just the language itself is very different. So, you know, Mandarin is an inflected language. So the way, the tone of your voice determines the meaning of what you're trying to say. So ma has 4 different meanings, connotations in Mandarin, just depending on how you inflect your voice with that. It would be depending on if you're calling for your mom, a horse, it's very, very different. Whereas American or English is not inflected. So I can say, how are you today? How are you today? You know, it doesn't really matter because we're not inflected. So when those students or scholars, faculty, staff are, you know, are trying to communicate with us, just, you know, being cognizant that their first language will also interfere sometimes with how they speak in their second language, which, you know, for us would be English. Be cognizant of the environment that you're in. You know, some cultures, like in Asian cultures, this lunch and learn would, while we appreciate it, we're still working. We're getting some, you know, learning in while we're doing, well, we're having our lunch. Some of us are working on emails and stuff and, you know, and listening to this presentation. But for, like, say, a lot of our Asian countries, this would be a no-no. They do not believe in mixing business with this kind of environment, like lunch is lunch. Lunch is for eating and relaxing, getting away from your desk, getting away from the work life. So those things are very separate. Just be aware of that. If you're trying to figure out why you're not getting a lot of student activity during events like this, when it would be more of their time, you know, just like I said, learn more about the culture and how something as simple as this lunch and learn that we just take for granted would, you know, would be social, you know, a social no-no for someone from another culture. Active listening and awareness. I always say there's a difference between, you know, I'm listening to you, but are you actually hearing that person? So active listening. Look at, you know, nonverbal cues when you're talking with some of these students or the faculty staff. How are they holding their bodies? How are they using hand gestures? What are their eyes telling you, their facial expressions? So it's more than just actually listening with your ears. It's like you are in being aware of the total experience of that interaction that you're having with those individuals. And just knowing that will really help you in, you know, putting that person at ease, making them feel like that they're really being heard in that moment. And I find that with our international student population, they're not always heard. People say, well, I listened, but they didn't really hear, you know, what that student or faculty staff was trying to really tell them. And then understand the other world view. Sometimes it's really hard for us to step out of our own environment and you know, understand somebody else's perspective. It's very easy for us to be comfortable in our own environments and, what we know. And then we expect other countries to kind of, know our social cues, our rules of engagement with each other, our communication styles. But I find that we rarely take the time to really understand another worldview. And again, I'm in that unique situation where, my culture is different anyway. So I'm already like I'm an outsider looking in when I'm interacting with most individuals on campus. So I think that makes me more aware of the frustrations and the challenges that our cultural differences that our international population are experiencing, or our Indigenous students, and what they're experiencing, while being on this campus. So I kind of make it my mission to really understand how I'm interacting with these individuals. If I'm not sure, this is the first time this semester that we've had a student from Turkestan. I can never pronounce it right. But so I had to look into that, learn about the culture, things that I might come up against when I'm dealing with this individual. He's a male. Are they a patriarchy? What's the biggest religion there? So I don't make a social faux pas. When I was speaking with him and his family and his guardian while he's here in the US, all which were male. There was no female was present. And in my office, we're predominantly female. So I wanted to make sure that when I went into this meeting with these individuals that, I had a very clear communication style ready to go. I learned about their culture. I was cognizant of my environment. So I met them in a formal way. So in our offices, not like in our living room space where it would be more relaxed. I let them take their time explaining their concerns, and what ETSU and what my office could do to help that student navigate this first semester. And I practice active listening. So I sometimes would have to repeat things back to them to make sure that I understood them correctly, but that really built a strong relationship that we now have with that student and his family, which I'm hoping will then in turn, help us with some recruitment efforts. But not understanding their culture, that other point of view could have also gone the opposite way, and put us at a standstill, because my culture is a matriarchy. So that in and of itself could have caused some conflict. So I have to be very aware also that my tendencies of being the matriarch of my family, taking that leadership role in my family in this office does not always, for some and other worldviews, is not appropriate for a woman to have this kind of positional power. So just being cognizant of that, will help you with this. And always, my office is available to anybody, who may have questions or trouble. That's part of why we're here, is to help you navigate, some of these items. And I just wanted to share some resources that I found super helpful, not only with, in my own scholarly work and preparing for dissertation and whatnot, but what helped me in putting these slides together. I have 3 books listed, and then a journal article that's I found really helpful in terms of explaining individualism and collectivism a little bit better than Me going, there's a difference. And I talked a lot faster than I anticipated. So I'm going to give you all the chance to ask me questions. And we can take as long or as short as we need to. I do hope that you found this helpful in some way when, I'm interacting with some of our Indigenous and international students. And feel free to unmute and just ask questions. I'm cool with that.
Hey, Chastity, thank you
Hey,
so
Debbie.
much.
Oh, thank you for joining. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. One of the things that you mentioned, just providing some examples that people do that feels offensive, is the comment about spirit animals or totems. And I'm curious, how do you respond to that? Because that comes up a lot for me too. And there's always a
when I first started at ETSU, I will say I have I'll just put it out there. I have a quick temper. That's the Irish and the Shoshone. I will say the Shoshone culture is their warriors. My clan is snakes in the grass because we could go in and strike and be out before the enemy knew we were there. And then the Irish, my granddaddy used to say, whew, you got them both. She's like a volcano. So sometimes I would just strike back because in anger. Now, you're a little bit older, you learn how to communicate better, more professionally. I generally will have to wait on it and reflect. And then after my temper cools, because you don't want to just garbage dump on, even though, because you find it so hurtful. And usually because I take it so personal, because for, I find that my native spirituality is such a big part of me. It makes me who I am. So it's more than just my culture. It's just, that's what connects me to my ancestors. That's what connects me to the spirit world. So before I would lash out and say mean things about their religion, if I knew they were, whatever their religious affiliation, I'd be like, oh, so, 1, 2, 3, which I knew was offensive in and of itself, but I'm striking back, right? So I'm like, don't do that to me if you don't want me to, I say return the favor. But now I'm much better. So that was younger Chastity in my graduate programs. But now I kind of tend to reflect on it, and then I'll write back and I do say, I did find that offensive for, Indigenous cultures, spirit animal. And then I explain, give them some resources and say, just, you wouldn't want somebody to mock your religion or your spirituality. So please be cognizant of the people that you are, that you're dealing with. And for our international student population here, we know our Indigenous population, but for our international students too, and we have students of all faiths here. So just thinking that Christianity is, well, because that's where we're at, right? Christianity is the major religion here. It's only been I'll caveat to that, only been the major religion since, Europeans took over control. When we had our own societies and our own spirituality and faiths before that. So I do find that offensive to think that we all have to be of one faith, so I try to be very cognizant that my spirituality doesn't mean you have to share that, but I'm respectful of that we have these differences. And I'll tell you, recently I had a student from India. She's Hindu. I didn't know how to react in this situation. She was evidently very grateful for the help that I showed her. She touched my left foot, the top of my left foot, and then her forehead. and then told me thank you. So I had to reach out to my former GA and say, what does that mean? Like, I didn't know how to react. I just like, oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So she did that to me twice, and I found it very uncomfortable because I'm like, ooh, you're touching me. And I'm not a touchy person. Don't do that. But I was informed that that is something that Hindus do, and it's usually only done to their elders and their families or to people that they truly respect. So for her to have done that to me was an honor, So when I could reflect on that, I was like, oh man, that's freaking cool, right? Because she let me experience something that I probably never would have experienced. So I had a new appreciation. So for me, this learning is always ever evolving. Every time you think you know something, you learn something different.
Yeah. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Chastity, thank you so much for this presentation. It was so rich. I was attending a webinar earlier today, and it talked about how for students, a lot of times when we interact with them, we share the same values with them, or even sometimes the same faith, but we have different experiences. In your work, what are some of the things we can do to kind of break down those barriers and connect with them with their experiences?
For me, so I've been able to be on both sides of the spectrum. I've had international students in the classroom when I was teaching in Lila for the English composition courses geared towards international students. And then of course, on my side now, more formal immigration side. So when I interact with different, students of different cultures, I use like the first class period, we talk about the syllabi, but then I'm trying to learn more about them. Like, where are my students from? Which then lets me go back and say, okay, well, I've dealt with students from Brazil, China. So I know learning is different, how they process that information, how that information is different, how they interact with us in the classroom is different. Being aware of that, will help us really connect with those students, because I can't tell you how many times I get faculty who really have not interacted with our international population before or well, and they're frustrated because they've had, like, let's say, a lot of international students in their classroom one semester. I just say, well, have you bothered to look up, how their school systems work? Like, if we're talking about some Asian students, they're not this give and take, this, back and forth conversation in the classroom. They sit there, they listen, and then they regurgitate that information back to you. So plagiarism for them is not a thing, so we have to teach them, what those differences are. And for me, like, I try to keep like hot topics for me, like I make myself aware of different religious or faiths that my students are, but then I try to avoid those hot topics in the classroom or when I'm interacting with them, because we're all so different. I prefer to avoid than to confront when we're doing that. And I'm also really aware that my upbringing, my culture influences the way, I interact, and it's hard. Sometimes I find it's easier for me to connect with my international students than it is for me to connect with other faculty and staff on this campus who, are from here, whether it be from Tennessee, just the United States in general, Western countries. So just, informing yourself, educating yourself is what I would say is your best bet of connecting with those students on a different level.
Thank you so much for your presentation today, Chastity.
Thank you for joining.
I'm an anthropologist here in the Appalachian Studies Department. And something, as you're talking, that I'm sitting here thinking about is it would be really great to have a full workshop to think about teaching styles and dynamics in the classroom. that focuses on different cultural learning styles and how we can incorporate different methods, because in some ways that seems contrary, what you're saying, to some of the more active teaching styles, where we're getting away from, I tell you what to learn and you learn it. And so that seems very, very different from in that way. So some kind of workshop to think through this and how we can, stay, up with, good pedagogy practices, and be offering what we need, so that we're bringing all of our students on this journey with us, would be great.
Yeah, I agree. If you know who we need to contact or something, I'd be happy to be a part of that team. I do know something, like I'll just give you a little tidbit about me. So I was in my master's program here in the Department of Lit and Language, and I was with a professor who had been teaching this one book for like 12 years, 15 years or something. So again, my culture, my social upbringing, gives me a very different viewpoint of the text that we were reading. So most of the students in the class, of course, are American, mainstream American. And so they viewed the text in the same light that he did. But when I read it, something totally different, came out of that. So he told me, I never would have considered that perspective. And I'm glad I had you in my classroom, because I never thought of it from, that way. And that's because, I'm bringing my indigenous culture into that. That's what's informing me on that text. So that's something that I tell my students when we're doing our new student orientation, is that I may never go to Saudi Arabia or China, Turkey, Turkeshistan, but I'm gonna learn through you. So this is, your chance to do a cross-cultural, small info sessions per se, in the classroom. And I would have never really thought about it that way unless, that professor said, hey, wow, something totally different. So when I talk to my students, I kind of talk about that, and how bringing that unique, different perspective in there will, make us see something totally different. It'll change our own worldview, and hopefully, break down those silos or that missing communication that often happens, or misunderstandings between our cultures.
I agree. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
The Center of Teaching Excellence, either Patrick or Phil or Allison may be able to, I know they've got ongoing events, but that might be a good idea to contact them to see if there's a way that a workshop could be conducted, even if it was just sort of like mini lunch and learns like this. I want to say thank you so much for your time. It gave me more perspective, probably than several classes I've had in the past in such a short period of time. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad I could do a little bit of good. Do we have any other questions?
Well, if we don't have any other questions, we are going to end a little bit early. However, if everyone could take notice of the chat, feel free to complete this evaluation. This allows us to continue to plan and bring topics that everyone is interested in. And then, of course, also on next Tuesday, we have Dr. Kevin Brooks. He will be speaking on DEI and well-being. And so I hope each of you join us again on next week. And again, we want to thank Chastity so much for this wonderful presentation, and y'all have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.